The reason we're here, CIJR analysis of the implications of the recent election in Israel. My very good friend, a colleague, and the associate director of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Professor Ira Robinson, of Judaic Studies at Prof, will introduce the morning, and he will be our timekeeper as well. Well noted for his efficiency in that.
We have the privilege this morning of hearing from 4 speakers, each of whom will be given 15 minutes. 3 of them are political scientists. The first up will be Professor Csaba Nicolenyi, who is the chair of the political science department at Concordia University. And his topic will be the Israeli party system after the 2013 elections. Next will come Professor Hal Waller, political science at McGill, domestic and international implications of the Israeli election. Next, Julien Bauer of the Département des Sciences Politiques at l'Université du Québec à Montréal, who will be talking on Bayit Yehudi, religious Zionism, part of a consensus or of a fragmented public opinion. And finally, Fred Krantz of Concordia University, who has already been speaking with you, and he is the chair of CIJR, the genius behind CIJR and its developments, who will be talking on Israel's soft right elections and foreign policy. Because all of these experts are going to be discussing very much the same territory, we will have questions after all of the speakers have finished. And at that point, you can address your question to one speaker in particular, or all of them in general, and see what. And once again, this is a topic that is that is in the news. Elections in Israel don't answer questions. Elections in Israel always raise questions, because elections in Israel are always just a prelude to the real drama, which is figuring out who is going to govern Israel. And we are in this dramatic stage, and I call on Professor Nicolenyi to start our analysis.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Krantz for including me in this panel. I have to start by warning you, because there is something that Steve, Rabbi Whitman, Fred, and Ira forgot to mention, and that is you are constituting an audience for a panel given to you by professors. That means there has to be a quiz. So at about 10:30, you will be quizzed about everything that you have heard for the next 50 minutes or so. That was a joke. So please relax and enjoy what's coming. I'm going to try to summarize what I have to say in about 15 minutes around 3 main points. And the first one is to highlight some of what I consider to be the main features of this electoral result. And here my central argument that I would like to leave you with is that really this election didn't bring to light anything new, anything unexpected. Some of the important consequences, and here throughout the next 15 minutes I will be limiting myself to understanding the nature of the domestic party system and its structural properties. What I want to tell you is that really nothing much has changed. And the reason why nothing much has changed has a lot to do with understanding the consequences of Israel's political institutions. More about that in a few minutes. Then I would like to offer you my views on why we got this result and not something else. I would like to go over some of the main recent developments in the Israeli party system that resulted, that could be considered to be the causes of this outcome. And finally, briefly, I'm going to point out what the implications of what I'm arguing are for the next 4 years, if this Knesset lasts for its full duration, or at least for the foreseeable future. And here I am going to deviate sharply from some of the commentators whom you might have read, both in Israeli and Western media, who portray an alarmist view of what's going to happen in Israel. My view is that just as the elections really didn't shake the earth, if you will, there are no major changes. Policy continuity and the status quo on most issues on foreign policy and domestic policy are expected to follow. So, by way of starting, let me refer to a couple of quotes from the Israel Daily Briefing that Dr. Krantz, the Institute, included in the brochures that you have in front of you. I'm going to ask you to look at the very last line, at the end of the last line on the first page, which starts with the word deeds, and then turn to page 2. So after describing the electoral result, this article by Michael Kaplan from Foreign Affairs argues that the two parties alone, that's Yisrael Beitenu and Likud, were expected to win around 50 seats, which would have put Netanyahu in a dominant position when it came to forming a governing coalition. Implication is that, of course, that never materialized. The two parties together won 31 seats. The implication here that that's bad news. I'm going to suggest that that's not the case. Netanyahu's Likud Beitenu ticket is actually as dominant as it should be, and it is a strategically very powerful position to determine the future course of coalition formation and governance in the Knesset. I'm going to ask you to look at, on page 3, the first paragraph of the second article by Liebler, published in the Jerusalem Post. And I quote, "The unexpected election results have created daunting challenges from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Many Israelis dislike Netanyahu. He has personality deficiencies, and like every Israeli leader since David Ben-Gurion, has made major mistakes." On page 5, in the concluding paragraph of that same article, please read the first sentence. "Under such circumstances, no stable government could be formed." So I'm going to start my brief presentation telling you why I think a stable government can be formed and why, if I were to make a prediction, will be formed. So if indeed we are going to face government instability in Israel over the next little while, please give me a call at Concordia. Remind me that I lied, my prediction failed. But I'm actually going to venture to make that prediction. And let me start spelling out why. A critical point to understand about how governments are formed in Israel really starts with understanding the nature of the electoral system. In contrast with what we are used to in Canada, Israel has a closed-list proportional representation electoral system with a very, very low threshold. Now, this institution guarantees that no single political party, on most conditions, would win a majority of the seats in the Knesset. And indeed, that has been the case starting right from the first election until today. As a result of that, in order to command the majority on the floor of the Knesset, political parties have to engage in intense bargaining after every election to make sure that a majority coalition government can be formed. In this process, the first critical moment, the first decisive moment is this: who wins the most seats? Because whoever wins the most, not the majority of seats, will be asked by the president to start the government formation process. Please rewind to 2009. You might remember the almost impossible difficulties that Israeli political leaders were confronted with. Kadima won the most seats, just one more than Likud, and that created a nightmare. Tzipi Livni wasn't able to find coalition partners to form a government with. Netanyahu did. However, he was forced to create what we call a disconnected coalition, a coalition that jumped over the centrist Kadima and brought labor leader Ehud Barak into the coalition. And that, of course, that disconnected, ideologically disconnected between center-left and center-right parties, created the groundwork for many of the instabilities that followed and that characterized the rest of the Knesset. In this regard, considering who won the election, who won this decisive first point of the electoral process, the result is very, very impressive from the perspective of the Likud-Netanyahu ticket. By winning 31 seats, considerably more than the runner-up, Yesh Atid, with only 19, this is a very different result. 4 years ago, the first two parties were just 1 seat apart from each other. This time, the difference between 19 seats and 31 is considerably different. So there is no question about the fact who has the mandate to start leading the government formation process, and indeed, it has not been debated. Even though the center-left formation, Tzipi Livni's Hatnua, Yesh Atid, and Shelley Yachimovic's Labour were trying to put together some kind of a center-left alternative. And the moment the election results came in, it was clear that Netanyahu will be in a position to start making the first offers. And whichever party is in that position to start making first offers, ultimately has such a strategic advantage that will decide the election or the government formation process in its favor. So the first point to remember is that the result, even though was fragmented, it was decisive. Having 31 seats over 19 collected by the runner-up party is very important. Second, and let me here question and challenge the argument made by the first author that we just looked at in Foreign Affairs a moment ago. Is this enough? Are 31 seats enough for Netanyahu to be in a dominant position to control any government that he wants to form? And the answer is yes. Now, but here the notion of dominance has to be understood in the context of parliamentary arithmetic. And this will be the only math I'm going to ask you to engage in, but please follow along with me. Parliamentary dominance is a very technical term that means the following. If a party, like Likud, can form a majority coalition with a set of parties A and another set of parties B, such that A and B cannot form a majority coalition without Likud, that means that Likud is in a dominant position because it can form alternative majority coalitions with mutually exclusive sets of parties. And if you do the parliamentary math, you will find that Likud can very easily do that. Let me give you a couple of examples. Although, and increasingly more likely, Likud form a very, very narrow majority coalition with Yesh Atid and Havayit HaYehudi, which would have 62 seats, just enough, barely enough, to control the majority of the Knesset. Likud could also form a coalition, a much more right-wing coalition that would include all the parties to the right of it, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and Havayit HaYehudi. If you put those parties together, they would not be able to come together in a majority coalition that would exclude Likud. And that's why Netanyahu can really take his time to sort out which of these alternative coalitions would give him the greatest policy leverage, would leave him laughing, if you will, and leave him in control and completely dominant position over whatever majority coalition would ultimately form. So in terms of numbers, 31 seats, even though it's far less than what many of us would have expected, given that Israel Beitenu and Likud joined on a single party ticket, it's enough. 31 seats can actually give you the kind of parliamentary dominance that 50 seats would have given you, which is what the article claimed. So this is point number 2. Again, the election is decisive. Likud has the mandate to form a government. 2, Likud is in a dominant position. 3, and this is a critical feature of any Israeli coalition bargaining scenario. Contrary to most expectations, Likud has also assumed a pivotal position in the Israeli party scene, as represented in the Knesset. Look at all the parties to the left of to the right of Likud: Havayit HaYehudi, United Torah Judaism, Shas. They don't have a majority without Likud. Look at all the parties to the left of Likud. Start with Hatnua, Yesh Atid, Hatnua, and go all the way to the other parties. They don't have a majority either without Likud. Neither the left nor the right can govern without Likud. In several European party systems, a party like Likud would actually go on governing alone, like the Harper government did a few years ago, exploit the divisions between left and right. It's unlikely to happen in Israel today. But it clearly shows that the ideologically pivotal position of Likud gives it added leverage and added opportunity to balance and exploit the divisions between the very divided Israeli left and Israeli right. So the elections were decisive. the elections left Likud in a dominant position in terms of numbers, and the elections also left Likud in an ideologically pivotal position. How many more minutes do I have? 5 minutes. Those were the main points. The rest is for fun. A couple of other important consequences of the proportional representation system that Israel has is voter turnout. Under proportional representation, voters tend to turn out in larger numbers to vote than under the kind of electoral system we have in Canada or what our friends down south in the US have. Now, and indeed, the commentators have very nicely commented on the fact that Israeli turnout in this last election showed a marked continued improvement. We are now at almost 67%. The last time Israeli elections registered such a high turnout were 3 elections ago. So what's important here to remember is that the shock that institutionally the Israeli political system suffered when the direct election for the prime minister was introduced and then was done away with. And those changes did result in a decline in electoral turnout as people didn't understand how to make sense of that very complex system. People also started suffering with election fatigue. The Israeli political system and the electorate starts recovering from that shock. And indeed, over the last 3 elections, we see a marked, continued, sustained increase in voter participation. And that is important because it certainly shows that the democratic nature and the representative nature of the Israeli political system and the electoral system is on very, very strong and firm foundations. The last important characteristic of the party system that I want to highlight and emphasize to you is the representation of minorities. The representation of Arab minorities has been there. Arab parties from the very beginning of the party system have had the opportunity to be represented, to run for office, although they never actually were included in governments, but that's a choice that they made, although they supported some left-wing coalitions earlier from the outside. What I would like to highlight is that, and that's an alarming tendency, and that is that compared to where the Arab voters were and the kinds of parties they voted for in the early 1990s, there's a marked change. In 1992, about half of the Arab votes, half of the votes from the Arab and Druze towns and townships in Israel were actually cast for Jewish and Zionist parties. By the last election, 2009, this was down to 18%. And although the results are still, these specific results are not in yet, by every prognosis, the numbers are further down. So there's a very clear distancing on the part of Arab voters away from the mainstream party system and concentration of those votes behind Arab parties. So to the extent that this indicates polarization, that's something for us to be aware of. Another important minority, and here I'm going to be using this word very carefully, has to do with women. And the representation of women over the last several elections in the Knesset continues going up. As a matter of fact, this last election registered the single largest number of female members of Knesset entering the Israeli parliament. There are 26, which is just over 1/5 of the totality of the Knesset membership. I have to skip over a number of other things that I wanted to tell you about, but in conclusions, let me just stress that because of the reinforced, very powerful, strategically powerful position of the Likud Beteinu ticket in the Knesset, because of its strategic advantages over all the other parties, both in terms of the number of seats it won and the ideological positioning in the center, which gives it the ability to divide left and right, gives me confidence to expect and predict that the policy course that the Netanyahu government embarked upon during its previous terms can continue unhindered. It's under no challenge to compromise its policies either from left or from right, and therefore I expect little change in the status quo. For those of us who appreciated the Netanyahu government's previous policies, this is good news. For friends and colleagues who were more critical, this may be less desirable, but I don't see major changes therefore coming from the Israeli domestic political scene, regardless of what other commentators might suggest. Thank you very much, and
thank you, Professor Nicolenyi. And now I call on Professor Bauer of McGill University.
down so many important points about the outcome of the election. I'm going to try to look a little bit more broadly at what this election represents, looking at trends in Israeli politics. Classically, Israeli politics has been divided into left and right, which of course is convenient in any political system, but I think is more difficult in the Israeli system than in others, because left and right is not necessarily defined in terms of classical economic beliefs. That is the conventional way of determining left and right. It's what we use in most Western democratic systems. In Israel, there are really three dimensions of policy that help us to orient where a particular party stands. One is the conventional economic position. Are you more statist? Do you want the government to be interventionist in the economy and society, which would be the left position? Or do you want the government to try to minimize its role, which would be the right position? And then there's the issue of security, and of course the right-wing position is a very tough line vis-a-vis the Arabs, very skeptical about the prospect for peace with the Palestinians, and generally in favor of a strong defense establishment and so forth. The left-wing position is much more conciliatory toward the Arabs, search for ways to achieve peace, be prepared to make lots of concessions in order to achieve peace, and so forth. And you can have in Israel people who are sort of left-wing on economic issues, but were very tough-minded on security issues, which was the classical position of the Labor Party for years and years. They represented strong defense, strong commitment to security, but a very statist attitude toward the economy. And then there's a third dimension, which has to do with religion. Is one in favor of a strong presence of the government in terms of religion, or does one want to move in the direction of a stronger emphasis on a secular approach to the question? Most parties in Israel don't take a strong position on the third dimension. They leave that to the purview of the religious parties, but some are more hostile toward the religious parties. There's militantly secular policies, and certainly a party like Krantz is in that category, and Yair Lapid's late father, Tommy Lapid, certainly was a militant secularist, and very hostile toward the interests of the religious parties. So even though a non-religious party may not have a position on the religious issues per se, where it stands on the religious secular divide is whether it is willing to deal on a cooperative basis with the religious parties or not. And interestingly, for example, not only Likud has been willing to deal with the religious parties, but Labor too. If you remember back to 1990, at which time there was a unity government between Labor and Likud, where Likud was led by Shamir, who was the prime minister. Labor was led by Shimon Peres, who is now the president of the state. And Peres tried to undermine the unity government by making a side deal with Shas in order to form a government that would leave Likud out in the cold. What it shows, of course, is that Labor, which is basically a secular party, was willing to make deals with the religious parties if it meant that Labor could become a dominant party in the system for at least a period of time. Now, Peres's gambit failed, and the result was a Likud-led government. Peres and Labor were shut out. But the point here is that each of these three dimensions affects the structure of coalitions, and sometimes there's surprising combinations. On the other hand, it's often common, especially in the media, to make very facile kinds of judgments about where politics stands in Israel. So, for example, this week, if you read the newspaper reports, they were trying to speculate as to whether there were enough seats going to the, quote, center-left bloc in order to prevent Netanyahu from forming the government. And of course, if the center-left bloc, whatever that might have been, would have had 61 seats, they would have said to the president, Bibi, no way, we want some other kind of prime minister. As it turns out, what they call the center-left bloc only got 59 seats, but in reality, that's not a bloc, and it's a very misleading perspective on Israeli politics, because what the media call the center-left bloc includes 11 seats from the Arab parties. And as Csaba said, ever since the beginning of the state, the Arab parties have neither been invited to join the government nor have sought to join the government. And really, it's incongruous to imagine the Arab parties joining the government, because what distinguishes the Arab parties from the other parties in the political system is that they are anti-Zionist. They're opposed to the very idea of a Jewish state. So it makes no sense for them to be part of the government of a Zionist state. And so what the media call the center-left bloc is really 48 Zionist seats plus 11 Arab seats. And that kind of a combination doesn't lead to anything constructive in the political system, which only reinforces the fact, which the media tried to gloss over, that that Netanyahu was in a very strong position after the election, rather than it being really close, cliffhanger election. It's also useful to look at the Israeli political system in terms of three camps. As you know, there's a multiplicity of parties. There were 34 parties that contested this election. 12 of them got over 2% of the vote, which meant that they get at least 2 seats in the Knesset, and that leads to lots of problems when forming and maintaining a government. But I think it's useful to divide the parties in Israel into 3 camps, certainly Zionist parties. There is the nationalist camp, which goes back to Menachem Begin and the Herut party, the African independence, and Likud, of course, is the inheritor of that position and is the leading party in that camp. There's the socialist or Labor camp, led historically by Poli, and then the Labor Party, which has problematic leadership now because the Labor Party has been so weak since the formation of Kadima several years ago. And then there's the religious camp, which consists of the National Religious Party, which used to be called National Religious Party, NRP, which was eclipsed after the emergence of Shas in the 1980s, but is making a comeback in the guise of Havayat HaYehudi in this current election. But it also consists of the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi parties, Yahadut HaTorah, which is basically the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox group, and Shas, which is the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox. Historically, when you have built coalitions in Israeli politics, you try to include at least 2 of these camps in the coalition government in order to achieve the necessary legitimacy to run the government. And thus, talk about excluding some of the parties in the religious camp raises questions about whether it's going to be feasible politically, maybe feasible mathematically, but not necessarily politically, to exclude certain parties. Now, what this 3-part division of the electorate and the party system leaves out, of course, is the fact that there now appears to be a center. One of the great questions that comes out of this particular election is, what is the meaning of the center in Israeli politics? Historically, Israeli politics has operated in terms of these 3 camps, leaving Arab parties aside for the moment. But at various points, there have been so-called centrist parties which have appeared on the scene, often making a big splash. Because if you can run in your first election and get a dozen seats, much less 19 that Yesh Atid got in this election, that is considered a tremendous accomplishment. So if you can think back to 1977, when Yigal Yadin's party, which was called Democratic Change or something like that, came out with 15 seats. There was great talk that this is going to revitalize the electoral system. We're now going to have a true center option for the voters. Well, what happened to Dash, the acronym for that party? They disappeared after one election. And then we all remember Tommy Lapid, who had the Shinui Party, which had 15 seats back in the early 2000s and pretty much folded. We remember, of course, there was a party called the Center Party in the 1990s, which had about 6 seats, but also disappeared from the scene. And then, of course, we had the great hope of the center, which was Kadima, which came on the scene when Ariel Sharon broke away from Likud, took a lot of his חברי Knesset with him, hooked up with some people from other parties, and in the first election that it contested, they won the election and formed a government under Ehud Olmert. So this finally was going to be a center party that had lasting power. And I remember saying to a political science colleague at that time, which was around 2006, I said, I don't think they're going to last a year. Obviously, my timing was off, but I think the basic prediction was correct. So center parties have not been successful in Israeli politics, and one wonders whether this center party, Yesh Atid, with 19 seats, will end up, long run, being any more successful as a permanent part of the Israeli electoral system than its predecessor parties. So I think there are lots of questions here, but I think that the implications in terms of the priorities in the government are that it is going to face a classic dilemma of democratic governance. One of the things that propelled Yesh Atid into such a successful election result was it was emphasizing what we call domestic issues, social issues, economic issues, things that were highlighted during the protests in 2011 when people were complaining in the streets because they couldn't find affordable housing. Food prices were too high, transportation was too expensive. People simply couldn't make ends meet in an economic system where the cost of goods is comparable to what we pay here in North America, but the incomes are perhaps half of what we have in North America. And that kind of mathematical economics equation, of course, is never going to balance out. So the cost of living was too high, and what the protests accentuated was that Israel has, as social scientists have known for many years, one of the greatest levels of inequality of any modern industrial nation. If you look at the OECD countries, there are 32 countries in the Organization for Economic Development. OECD is development, but anyway, we all know what they are. Of those 32 countries, I think Israel is the worst in terms of inequality. The U.S. is pretty far down on the list, but Israel is the worst or very close to the worst. So this is a pressing issue, and yet every Israeli government faces the pressing issue of security, threats such as the Iranian nuclear threat, diplomatic issues such as what to do vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and so Israel is going to be faced with a new government of the classic guns versus butter dilemma. And I'm not sure how they're going to solve it because the resources aren't there, and it's going to be perhaps one of the biggest challenges that the government is going to have to face. Briefly on the forefront of the negotiations with the Palestinians. I think the media, again, is getting it wrong. I don't think that Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid is going to be any kind of a pushover in terms of being forced into negotiations that are going to be deleterious for Israel's interests. Everything I've heard out of the guy suggests that he understands what has to be done and what the realm of possibility is. The difference between him and Bibi Netanyahu is that I think Lapid understands that it's better for Israel to be open to the idea of negotiations, even if he's pretty sure the negotiations are going to go nowhere. And there's a pretty broad consensus in the Israeli public that no matter how open Israel is in terms of the negotiating stance, the Palestinians are not prepared to make the deal. And so the risks of going into negotiations are small, but the gains are great in terms of repairing relations with President Obama in the United States and in improving Israel's stance vis-a-vis the European countries. So I would suspect that there will be a greater likelihood of entering into negotiations with the Palestinians, but most Israelis understand that there is an essential incompatibility between the Israeli position, the maximum that Israel would be prepared to offer to the Palestinians, and the minimum that the Palestinians have convinced themselves that they can accept in terms of negotiations. These are mutually exclusive positions, and therefore I don't see how it is possible to reach any kind of a solution. Bearing that in mind, I think it becomes somewhat easier to build a coalition government because some of the inherent contradictions between the positions of the various parties that Bibi will want to bring into the government can be glossed over with the understanding that, well, we're going to take this kind of position, but it's not going to require us to make the hard decisions that could break a government apart. And so we can all handicap the negotiations for a new government, which are beginning now, which will probably not end for another month or more. But it appears to me that from a strategic point of view, Netanyahu is going to want to build a fairly broad coalition which could exceed 80 members of the Knesset and will leave Sheli Yachimovich and Galon, the head of Meretz, pretty much in the political days. Thank you very much.
Okay, and now I have the privilege of introducing to you Professor Julien Bauer of Sciences Politiques in the Université de Montréal. Professor Bauer pointed out to me that in Quebec, French has to be twice as prominent as English, so he says, can I have 30 minutes? And I say, if it's in French, you may.
You will.
So I'm not sure if I do it half an hour in French or 15 minutes in English. I'm not sure. I'll see. Okay. English? Okay, fine. So I'll side with my what can I say after my two esteemed colleagues were so bright and so marvelous? First of all, I'm very happy with elections, which can be surprising. I'm happy for two reasons. First of all, that there was election. We take it for granted, but I'm just asking the question, how many countries who live in a permanent state of war with neighbors who want to kill them? Basically, all of them, Palestinian and Syrian and what have you. And they continue to have a democratic life. It's amazing. And I find amazing that we take it for granted. We don't even say it's marvelous. They managed to continue having a democratic system in such an unpleasant environment. Two, I'm not so happy for the people who won the election, but I'm overjoyed for the people who lost. A few names that we have was. The first big loser is Eudolmet. I don't know if you remember, a few weeks ago, it would be the kingmaker, it would be the one to decide who will be the next Prime Minister of Israel. And today is what is, a garnish, and nothing. He should be in jail with Jacques Chirac, former president of France. People who don't know the difference between public budget and private pocket. More dishonest than that you cannot have, and he lost. And his representative in the Knesset was not exactly a big winner, simply the most probably one of the most incompetent leaders of any Israeli party for the last 50 years. She managed. She won last election with one extra mandate compared to Likud. Then because she was on very bad terms with everybody else, she couldn't form a coalition. Then she became leader of the opposition. And she went the world over to attack the government of Israel. The leader of the opposition attacked the government in the country. That was the role of the leader of the opposition. You don't go outside, overseas, to attack the legitimacy of your own government. Nobody does it except Tzipi Livni. And when two summers ago, there was the 10th demonstration for more money for the middle class. Exactly people who voted for her. She waited 2 weeks to join them. Therefore, she does not understand anything. Inside, outside, she's out. Okay. Another one who is a big loser, and nobody said the name, is Shalom Arshad, Peace Now. Peace Now is represented today by Meretz, a few people from Labour, Arab parties, and that's it. Maximum 20 people out of 20 Knesset, out of 120. Everybody else, including the so-called left, right, I agree with you, I don't know what that's happening. But there is nobody today in Israel who would follow the line of Shalom Arshad, which is to give everything, including Jerusalem, to the enemy. Therefore, they are reduced to what's represented in the public opinion. 15%, 20%, 20% too much. But 20%, if you're a Democrat, it's not the end of the world. During the last, let's say, 20, 30 years, was two major trends within Israeli politics. One was that the two major parties, were Likud and Labour, went down. They used together to have more than half of the votes, therefore half of the seats. And they went to below 40% together, which means that the major party went down. And the opposite to that was the emergence of ephemeral parties. Parties who suddenly the savior. They get 10, 15 mandates, they can go for 2 elections, and the third one, poof, they disappear. Therefore, what you have is 2 major parties going down, 1 ephemeral party going up for a short period of time, and then another ephemeral party gets in, which does not make the system work very easy. And perhaps a third comment was the weakening of the religious party. Why? Because they were too modern for the ultra, not enough religious for the other one. So you have a sum, and the increased power of the Haredi parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism. People who willfully don't want to be part of the consensus. Okay. So the impression would be that with the result of the last election, we have a very fragmented public opinion in Israel, and it's what you can read in most papers. And I believe that this reading is false, and that in fact there is a basic consensus. 4 reasons for that. First of all, nearly every new member of the Knesset, and half of them have been elected for the first time, are both in favor of a Palestinian state, but not at any price. Only if it's the end of the war. If it's not the end of the war, forget it. Therefore, open to negotiation, yes. Open to surrender, the policy of Shalom Arshad, of Ehud Olmert, who was ready to give Jerusalem to the enemy, who was ready to give Harabai, the Temple Mount, to the enemy. These people are totally out. Therefore, what you have to do, what you have today, is basically the end of kind of political messianism. That if we just give everything to the Palestinian authorities, there will be peace in our time forever and ever and ever. Most Israelis, including people from the left, understand it's not true. And it's not by chance that the Labour Party was very, very aware of the fact they didn't talk too much about negotiation with the Palestinians. They say, in case of, we'll push for an agreement. But we won't beg them to come to us. And Lapid, he was quoted 2 years ago saying, Jerusalem, forget about it. It's ours. It could change. But the fact that it is said and people voted for it. So it's not exactly the position of the extreme left. So basically, you have people who say, well, going back to the traditional right-wing way of thinking, or the old Labour Party one, who were leftists on the internal politics, but who were patriot, Zionist, defending the rights of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. That was the traditional position of the Labour Party. It went out for a few years, and it came back. And it's because of that that Yakimovich got so many votes. Without it, I believe it would have gone also in the dustbin of the history. Okay, that's the first one. Two, there was a belief that, and for a few people it was very pleasant, the belief that religious Zionism was out. And the obituary was a little bit premature. Why? Because when a party who was one of the big ones, the religious, National Religious Party got up to 12 seats 25 years ago. They were part of nearly every governmental coalition, both with Labour and with Likud. But they became focused only on the settlements, nothing else. They forgot social issues, and they were attacked, as I said a little bit before, by the militancy of the Haredim, who would say, they're not truly fruit. They don't have a black hat. How can you take seriously somebody without a black hat? Yeah? And on the other side, there are people who say, who needs a religious party? You can wear a kippah and be religious and vote for Likud or vote for Labour. I remember when there was Menachem Cohen, who was a rabbi of the Moshavim and Kibbutzim, who was a Chaver Knesset for the Labour. He was a rabbi. But so how can we explain the coming back of Bennett? I believe he's a perfect example. It's not only him as an individual, but first of all, that man is religious but open, which is not obvious in Israel. Usually you have a tradition to be my Stibler and everything else is fine. He's more open-minded. He had people in his list who are not religious. He wants to attract them, and he does not, when you see him on TV, he has a kippah on. But except the kippah, it could be anybody else. He does not look like somebody who wants to impose his religious view on society. Two, he was top in a elite unit in the army, which makes a big difference with the Haredim, who don't go to the army. It's not only that he went, that he was a top guy there, up to the point that when he was attacked during the electoral campaign, people were under his orders a few years ago. Both people from the left and the right defended Bennett, saying he's a mensch, he's somebody we can trust. And in Israel, where security is very important, that shows also you were a keeper, but at the same time, you're doing not only military service, which is obvious, but you're doing much more than that. And three, he was in the high tech and managed to sell his share for, I believe, $140 million. So you make a lot of money, which is not exactly the image of the religious guy in Israel. So it's religion with a smile, religion fighting the enemy, and religion making money in business. Which are exactly amazing. Okay. Three, there is the problem, the perennial problem of military service for the Haredim, for the Orthodox. I believe it will be settled this time. Why? Because except the Haredim, everybody is in favor of them serving the army. Everybody, both Likud and what is left of Kadima and Labour, and everybody.
And even the Torah.
And Bennett. And okay. But people don't want to have a war with them. They can imagine, rabbis, rebels with the Streimer and beard and everything, with a few hundred young people getting out of Israel because we are oppressed by Israel. Can you imagine? So what will happen most probably will be there will be a law to tell them to go to the army. A large proportion of them will receive a deferment. People who are so smart that they have to sit and learn non-stop. At the beginning it was 1 or 2%, it will be, in my view, at least 25%. Yeah? So not the best and the brightest, 25% is more or less average. And the balance will go either to specific units within the army, or they will be offered to do national service, not in the army. And by the way, national service will be also open to Arab citizens. Therefore, you cannot impose military service to Arab citizens, but national service you could. That's another thing. Okay. There will be a kind of quid pro quo, and the Haredim know that they are not on the winning side this time, and I believe they would agree. There will be a lot of fight, a lot of demonstration, a lot of stupidities. I can already tell you what some rabbis will say. It will be absolutely crazy, but in the long run, it will be settled. The only bad part of the whole story is that there is a consensus of a new economic policy, which I believe is crazy, because everybody wants more money for the poor little middle class, pay less taxes, and get more advantages and lower the price and what have you. It costs a lot of money. And in that case, we will go back to, even if Israel has the lowest level of unemployment of the OECD, which is amazing, most probably a lot of money will be spent perhaps in a nice way, but not in a very smart way. So that's why inflation will get up, and the economic situation will be worse next year than it is today. But if everybody wants it, everybody, including all those who will be part of the government, there is not too much you can do. So basically, functioning democracy, realism instead of political messianism, more or less a solving of the Haredi problem with the army, and a kind of agreed upon a stupid policy on economics. I believe it's stupid, but they will do it. All of that, that's all the ingredients for a consensus, far from a fragmented public opinion.
You leave the best for the last, Fred Krantz, Concordia University.
Io parlo italiano.
Andiamo.
So I want to talk about the soft right consensus that this election represents and its implications for Israel's security situation and foreign policy. My colleagues have given 3 wonderful talks. They've stolen much of my thunder, turned away from me. And let's see if the fact that I'm an historian, not a political scientist, makes any difference in how I perceive, how I see things. For me, the election signifies 3 things. First, what I call the evergreen utility of an old aphorism, and that is that there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. Second, that it exemplifies what very great German historical sociologist Max Weber called the primacy of politics. Come back to that. And third, that it exemplifies really the theme of my talk, that Israel's electorate has arrived at a very broad security and foreign policy consensus that on the Palestinian issue, the regional security issue, and above all, this is the 800-pound canary, the Iranian nuclear crisis development. And I've noted that in much of the analysis of the election, the Iranian issue is never even touched on, which is very interesting. Perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. First, the problem of analyze and statistics. It's very interesting that all the major media in Israel, in North America, and in Europe, relying on multiple polls taken in Israel, wrongly predicted the outcome of this election. Generally, the idea was, the New York Times led the way, as usual, that the election would result in a far-right, radically far-right victory, which would be terrible for Israel and the region, blah, blah, far right. That Israel wouldn't come to terms with the Palestinians, that Israel would be aggressively anti-Arab, and so on. Of course, that didn't happen at all. Israel Beitenu lost 11 of its former 42 seats, and the left, by the same token, the left didn't exactly feel any wind beneath its sails. The left did poorly, with Labor receding somewhat, supposedly getting only 6 votes, and so on. So I agree with Julien, who made the point in his talk that this had happened, and that in a way, what's lacking in much of the media analysis, and it's part of the negative attitude towards Israel generally, is a celebration of the sheer fact of Israeli democracy in the context of the declining security situation in the region, Egypt, Syria, failed Arab Spring, and so on. You have all kinds of analysis of Egypt and very scholastic analysis of the democratic elements in Egypt, but no notion how remarkable it is that Israel, confronted with what she is confronted, pulls off the most democratic elections in the world in many ways, with our proportional representation system, which Csaba noted. What actually emerged, and my colleagues have noted this, is a kind of what I call a right-center preponderance. There's a domestic focus, clear, social and economic issues. Yesh Latif comes back with 19 votes in this case. His emphasis on the problem of ultra-Orthodox service and the IDF, we'll come to that in a moment. But the foreign policy result is the emergence of a kind of broad center on key issues of security. Max Weber, who at the end of the 19th century was an opponent of Marxism, understood clearly that while social and historical dynamics involve economic, political, and cultural ideological factors, history, above all, rests upon and is made by politics. Politics is everything. Politics, not the economy, is an independent variable in historical dynamics. And this has much to do with intangible human qualities which we call leadership. Politics has everything to do with leadership. And if we look at the Israeli election, what do we find? There are able leaders and clearly much less able leaders, and the quality of leadership has something to do with the electoral returns. That has a great deal to do with it. Bibi Netanyahu, for all of the negative coverage he gets in the Western media, is an able, experienced leader who has nurtured a kind of emerging center-right in Israeli politics. The fact that his vote total went down, partially it refers to the rise of Naftali Bennett on his right, taking votes away from him. But as Csaba pointed out, he still comes up with 31 votes, and he is the central figure in the making of any coalition, whether it's a center-left or a center-right. That's very important. Israel has a leader, especially at this moment of terrible security problem. Yair Lapid, former actor, journalist, similarly able to ride the wave of the domestically centrist movement with social concerns, but at the same time, as we'll see in a moment, not at all center-left when it comes to security issues in Israel. And that lends the possibility of his joining, it's already being negotiated, a Netanyahu-led large coalition. Naftali Bennett of the Jewish Home Party took right-wing and religious votes away from Likud, but as Julien has pointed out, he did it he's a very attractive candidate in many ways, and by no means is read by the electorate generally as a kind of ultra-Orthodox figure, far from it. So you have the makings of the broad coalition right there, potentially. Likud, Baitenu, Jewish Home, and Yesh Levin. So Israel's elections throw light on how politics and leadership, in fact, shape politics generally, and particularly elections specifically. So third, there emerges, the bulk of the burden of my presentation, there emerges a clear right-center, soft right, I call it, a soft right security consensus. Here again, the pundits and the pollsters missed the vote, as Hal has noted. The key parties upon which the new coalition will be based are, again, Likud, Baitenu, Yesh Atid, Jewish Home. Shas can probably be brought into that coalition, and possibly even the 6 votes of Tzipi Livni, a few other small parties, and so on. Let me just say a point about Yair Lapid, the Yesh Atid leader. He did, in fact, give a very important speech in the so-called settlement, the community of Ariel, which was itself a symbolic act that he spoke there. He emphasized, and has done so consistently, the unity of Jerusalem. And he has noted that while a two-state solution may well be an ultimate goal and worth looking into, if there is any kind of Palestinian leadership, which might, in fact, Israel might, in fact, work practically with. But until that happens, he has said repeatedly, there can be no negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas, who now is seen by Israelis as really a compromised figure, a forked-tongued leader, who just last week announced that the Zionist movement had participated with the Nazis in trying to arrive at a deal in the Second World War. You know that Abbas got his PhD from the noted, intellectually wonderful entity of Russian University in Moscow, and his PhD thesis was on the Holocaust denial, very much so. And you know, of course, that he was also a key figure in planning the Munich Olympics. Probably didn't know that, some of you, because that has been well covered up by the Western media. He's not a grandfatherly figure, sweet, moderate man at all, but he is a typical PLO leader, and he has more in common with the guys in Gaza than he has with the guys in Jerusalem. Let's put it that way. The Israeli electorate knows this. There is a consensus. And that brings us to what I think is the importance of the election. When Netanyahu called this election, a number of observers said the key rationale for calling it, why this election at this time, key rationale seemed to be to develop a kind of broad consensus on a national unity government in order to deal with the Iranian threat. The Iranian threat is gathering momentum. It's very clear. All responsible analysts, including the IAEA now, the International Atomic Energy Association, have indicated that within 3 or 4 months, this is going back a couple of months, the Iranians who have been increasing the number of centrifuges steadily, making the uranium you need for bombs, within 3 or 4 months, the Iranians will have, I think I call them the Uranians. The Iranians will have enough enriched uranium to put together 3 or 4 warheads. Now, it's true, you have to put the warheads, you have to put them on top of you have to put the warheads on the proper missiles, and that takes time and it takes engineering, but that's really just a matter of time. It's not brain surgery. So Israel has to take this into account. And Netanyahu has said very clearly, the last 2 years, we have a red line. The red line is, if they approach nuclear capacity, we will have to act. He went to the UN in the fall, and he held up his sign, and he said, here's the red line. And he put whatever pressure he could on the American President, Obama, in order to get him to, in fact, also announce a red line. Now, you'll notice this gets rather scholastic, but the Americans, Obama says, oh yes, we're going to act. If the sanctions don't work, when they get a weapon, we will intervene. And that's much too late. That isn't, that's just dissimulation. The key moment is capacity, capability. The minute that the Iranians have enough uranium for a bomb, they have augmented their power in the region, and vis-a-vis Israel, remarkably. I think, by the way, you might, if you want to see a parallel case, it's before us today, the last few days in the news. It's North Korea. The North Koreans have bombs. They now have a missile which can reach the U.S. And what are they doing? They're threatening the United States. We now can reach the United States, and you guys better listen to what we want to do, etc. Okay. And if anything, the current leadership in Iran is more meshuggah than even the North Koreans, who are not religious, extreme religious, millenarians, people happy to be monks. So we have to look at that. We have to look at American policy. We have to look at the re-election of Obama. We have to look at the 3 people that he has now nominated for high cabinet positions. Hagel to be Secretary of Defense, Kerry to the Secretary of State, and Brennan to be his CIA director. All 3 of these people are either positively anti-Israel or seemingly couldn't care less about Israel. They don't resonate to the American pro-Israel position. The fact that Obama made these nominations in the face of concerns, articulated concerns, show us the direction of his thought, of his policy vis-a-vis Israel. What it means is that as the crunch appears, it's a terrible situation Israel faces, and the world is ignoring it. Right? One atom bomb exploded, God forbid, exploded over Tel Aviv, and Israel is finished. And therefore, it cannot be allowed, and it will not be allowed. So if America won't act, and I think the clear indication from Mr. Obama is it will not act, then Israel is going to have to act alone. And that is coming. And we, the Jewish people, and particularly in diaspora, I think are ignoring this for some reason, suppressing it. Okay? We're at 1939, and worse. Hitler didn't have an atom bomb. And Ahmadinejad and company look like they're going to have one if Israel doesn't act. So what is remarkable here? And if we're religious, maybe we will see some meaning of this. What is remarkable that an election occurs in this approaching context, in which for the first time, as my colleagues have noted, a kind of broad center has emerged, and in which Netanyahu, with his red line, and I think commitment to action, may have a coalition of between 72 and 81, giving national backing to the policy that I think will have to be adopted. So it is fortuitous, if not divinely ordered, that such a moment occurs. And we should be conscious of this and doing everything we can to assure that our own Jewish leadership is aware of it and ready to act when the moment comes. Thank you.